Well, Kevin, I hate to brag, but it is my birthday. Last week at Platformer, we broke some news.
What was the news that you broke?
So the Stanford Internet Observatory, which is this small but I think very influential group that studied the way groups use online tools to spread disinformation, is basically being dismantled and will no longer exist as we know it.
And why is this a big deal?
So this group was the most savvy and well-connected among the tech platforms, and they had really good relationships with companies like Facebook or Twitter when that existed. And so as elections would take place, the SIO, as they called it, would be in close communication with the platforms to understand, one, what narratives are going viral, some true, some false, and then be able to report that back so that people like you and me who are trying to understand, hey, what's happening in this election? Is there any foreign interference taking place? Like, are there some narratives that are gaining a lot of traction? We would be able to understand that in real time, write about it, and sort of help people understand events as they were unfolding in real time.
Yeah, and I would say to take a step back, like the Stanford Internet Observatory was one of these sort of groups that sprung up in the wake of the 2016 election when all this viral, disinformation went around on social platforms. There was this Russian interference campaign. These social networks all started to take this kind of thing much more seriously, and there sprang up kind of these research communities who were filled with academics who wanted to look at the way that information, both true and false information, travels online, about influence campaigns, things like that. And I would say the Stanford Internet Observatory was the most prominent of the kind of academic groups that sprung up to study this issue.
Yeah, I think it was just a really natural response to the fact that we had Russian interference in the 2016 election, and it drew a lot of folks' attention to the fact that these networks could be exploited, that they could be really useful for spreading propaganda. And then after that, a bunch of academics came forward and said, hey, well, why don't we take a look at that?
So all that seems like it should be kind of relatively uncontroversial, right? Academics studying how information travels on the internet. But the Stanford Internet Observatory did attract quite a lot of criticism and attention, especially from partisans on the right. So what happened?
Well, so in 2022, the Republicans retake the House, and the Republican Jim Jordan starts what he calls the Select Subcommittee on the Weaponization of the Federal Government, which is nominally designed to take a look at improper contacts between the federal government and platforms. And the fear there is that maybe the government was pressuring platforms to take down speech, to censor speech, and to violate First Amendment rights. And SIO gets dragged into the middle of this because while there's not a lot of evidence of the government directly pressuring platforms to remove speech, there is plenty of evidence out there that SIO was talking to platforms about, hey, look at all of these tweets that, might violate your policies. You might want to take a look at that. And so I want to be clear that there isn't really a super coherent narrative that emerges out of this. It's just sort of this miasma of partial facts, half-truths, innuendos, right? But it all gets spun up into this government committee that has subpoena power. And so Jim Jordan starts going after some of these academics, dragging them before these hearings and saying, hey, what were you doing with respect to the election?
Right. And this is part of this kind of larger conservative backlash to what they see as online censorship by tech platforms, which they believe are trying to suppress conservative speech, and that they have the allegation is that they have sort of hidden this effort behind these kind of academic veneers, that you have groups like the Stanford Internet Observatory, which they believe are functioning as kind of arms of the federal government to work hand in hand with the platforms to sort of remove unpopular or conservative speech.
Yes, that is the charge. There is no evidence that any of that is true. And I just want to say, it's like, why was SIA doing this work? Well, they were worried that some of these narratives might take hold and turn really violent, which is, of course, exactly what happened after the 2020 election, right? We have January 6th. We have the Capitol being stormed. And instead of focusing on that, some people in the government want to focus on, which accounts were removed? And I should just say, after I published my piece, Stanford responded, disputing the idea that SIO is being dismantled, and said they were going to continue a bunch of this work under new leadership. But this is a smaller team, and several of the core people who were doing the original work are now gone.
So That brings us to our guest today, Renee DiResta. She's one of the people who worked at SIO. She was actually the research manager of the Stanford Internet Observatory. And you and I have both known Renee for years. She's a person who lots of journalists and media people have relied on for research and data and insight about what's happening on social networks. And in a strange way, she has almost become a central character in the story of online disinformation because she has been targeted by Jim Jordan and his committee, but also many of these sort of right-wing influencers who have decided that she is a sort of shadowy figure in the effort to suppress conservative speech.
That's right. She did an internship at the CIA, like when she was younger. And so now they call her CIA Renee online and are constantly hinting that she still works there, even though that's not true.
I got to say, that's kind of a cool nickname.
It is. I wish I had a nickname that cool. I'll tell you that much. But look, it's really a sort of crazy twist of fate because as all of this was unfolding, Renee was working on this book called Invisible Rulers, where she sought to chart these changes in the information ecosystem. How does propaganda work these days? How do what she called these cinematic universes get spun up out of almost nothing and then take over entire political subcultures? And so we wanted to talk to her about that because this is somebody who not only has an uncommonly good understanding of the media world that we live in today, but has had to live through some of the worst parts of it.
Yep.
Yeah.
Totally. All right, let's bring her in.
Renee DiResta, welcome to Hard Fork.
Thank you for having me.
So I want to get to everything that happened at the Stanford Internet Observatory, but first I want to ask, what was the original spark for the book that you just published?
The original spark for the book, I just wanted to write about how propaganda and influence had changed. It was really, honestly, I started the project before all the subpoenas and lawsuits and all the BS, and I really just wanted to write a book, kind of like Manufacturing Consent did in the 1980s, right, where he's writing about here's this incentive structure and here's the outputs that come out as a result of it. And I thought we haven't really had an update to that in 40 years or so, so maybe I'll write one. And then, of course, couple months later, the conspiracy theories about us started, then the subpoenas came down, and then I was like, well, I didn't want to write a memoir, but I guess I am.
But now you are, yeah. I want to talk a bit more about this idea that something has changed about propaganda over the past couple of decades. What had you noticed in your work that made your ears perk up and say, there's something interesting here to dig into?
I spent a lot of time looking at the anti-vaccine movement as a new mom in 2013 to 2015 timeframe, right? But I didn't actually think of that as propaganda at the time. That was not, I thought of it as activism, right? We are fighting, we are pro-vaccine people, we are fighting those anti-vaccine people. We have a law we want to pass in California, we have a campaign, and we're going to fight it on the internet. And the thing that's interesting about it is whenever you have a political campaign, there's like a start date and an end date, right? But they did not see it as having a start date and an end date. For them, this was their thing, and they were on it 24/7, and they had built an entire community. There were thousands of anti-vaccine accounts. This is years prior to COVID, just to clarify. We're talking about measles vaccines here. And I thought it was interesting that I thought of this as something that this is activism, we're turning it on and off. But they thought of it as something that was persistent. They were going to message forever because they were really true believers in this idea that vaccines caused autism. So that was kind of my first experience. And then I felt like I'd sort of seen the future, right? I was like, this is how every campaign is going to be fought. I can run ads on Facebook. I can granularly target down to the zip code level, and nobody knows who the hell I am, and I don't have to tell them. And this is absolutely insane, actually. This is wild. And then around the same time, ISIS was doing its thing. And that I saw as propaganda, right? This is something with, they have an iconography, they have a flag, they are out there.
And at the time, they were recruiting heavily on social networks.
Yes,
right?
they were. Basically, they were like ISIS influencers. We didn't call them. I didn't have that vocabulary quite then. This was, again, 2015. But it was, women posting selfies with their fighter husbands and their guns or their kittens, And it was this absolutely surreal thing. And I thought, okay, this is propaganda. They're an explicitly political organization. There's nothing remotely surreptitious about this. They're building a brand. So I thought, okay, well, and they're using the same, like very, very similar techniques, right? We're welcoming you into the fold. We're giving you the truth. This is the way of the world. So I wound up doing some work on the question of how do you respond to that? And it turned out the government had no clue how to respond to that, which was, why I was like, I'm in this room. Where are the adults? So that realization that anybody could do this and everybody was going to be was, I think, what made it a motivating factor for me to write about.
Yeah. You were very early to understanding that social networks provided this really powerful new vector for anyone who wanted to grow a movement, to do activism, to spread propaganda. I first encountered your work during those years. And then you get to 2019 after you've been doing all this work and the Stanford Internet Observatory comes about. So what is or was SIO, and what did you do there?
So SIO started in 2019. I never actually worked on right-wing content or hate speech or anything. In the entirety of my 10 years doing this, I've never published on that topic. It was just not one that I spent my time on. But we did this project called the Election Integrity Partnership in 2020. And the EIP was an interinstitutional collaboration. There was us, Kate Starbird's team at UW, University of Washington Center for an Informed Public, Graphica, Digital Forensics Research Lab. Most of us had pretty deep expertise looking at state actor campaigns.
And this, just so I'm giving the listeners enough background here, this was the Election Integrity Partnership was sort of an ad hoc group of organizations that were looking specifically at attempts to undermine the election on social media.
Absolutely. So I think sometimes you see right-wing media report that, it was somehow related to Hunter Biden's laptop. That's BS. Or that had something to do with, like political speech in the context of candidate A saying something about candidate B.
But you were
doing
things like, monitoring. There was this thing, Sharpiegate, which is sort of a conspiracy theory about people, basically manipulating ballots.
Yes. So the scope was exclusively limited to things related to policies and procedures having to do with voting. So it was that kind of stuff, Sharpiegate making an allegation that a felt tip pen would invalidate a ballot. And that specifically, the sort of other piece of it was the delegitimization narratives. So in the context of Sharpiegate, again, that those felt tip pens were only given to Trump supporters to steal the election, right? So we were only looking at narratives related to the election. We did not care about Hunter Biden's laptop. But, what winds up happening is that work, which did involve occasionally speaking with state and local election officials. And you see Fox News call Arizona for Biden, and all of a sudden the Sharpie story goes from being just some people concerned about Sharpie markers to that's how they stole Arizona, right? And so state and local election officials, meanwhile, throughout the entirety of Election Day, are trying to ensure that people have confidence in the election and that if there is something irregular or weird that is happening, that they know about it. But election officials are not supposed to be sitting on the internet all day long. That is not their actual job. It is, in fact, our job. And so we were like, well, okay, we can communicate with state and local election officials. And what this meant was that they would occasionally send tips, basically, hey, can you look at this tweet? Can you look at this post? And oftentimes we looked at it, but it was some random guy with 2 followers who was like wrong on the internet. But then sometimes there were these things that got a whole lot of attention and a whole lot of pickup. And in certain cases, we would also tag tech platforms and just say, hey, you should have a look at this. Now, this was reframed as government officials were using us, giving us things that they wanted taken down, and that we were then telling platforms to take them down, that this was like this vast operation. And they turned it from being state and local election officials to being like DHS itself, because DHS is responsible kind of at a federal level for elections. And so you have this conspiracy theory that we are somehow being used. And I mean, the numbers that these sort of like right-wing blogs start to write are like 22 million tweets, entire narratives nuked from the internet with an AI censorship superweapon. I'm not kidding. That was the actual phrasing, right? And, this is the sort of thing where in a normal polity, this would be seen as tinfoil hat BS. But in this reality, Jim Jordan is like, yes, we need to investigate this. We need to investigate the AI censorship superweapons run out of Stanford University.
So let's just finish the narrative arc here, because we have, this sort of pushback from the right to these groups and platforms that are engaging in what they believe is politically motivated censorship. Jim Jordan starts sending out all these, not only letters, but subpoenas. He gets a bunch of emails from, from platforms communicating with governments and academic institutions. And then something happens with Stanford itself, which is spending tons of money. I think you've said millions of dollars to defend
testimony,
to defend against these claims and to respond to these subpoenas. And maybe at first that feels like they're sort of on your side. They're sticking up for the research team. But at some point, that seems like it started to change. You recently learned that your position at the Stanford Internet Observatory was being discontinued, that there was not going to be more funding made available for you to continue working there. And I'm just curious what your emotional reaction was when you heard that.
So several of us were given that news at the same time, that there was no funding. And, I think the reaction was disappointment, obviously. Well, my reaction was disappointment. I can't speak for them. We have a really close-knit team, and we do amazing work together. And again, I think for us, the immediate reaction was, are there ways to get funding for particular project lines, right? Is there the child safety work? I mean, I think it's perhaps just to make it clear, like there are certain tools that we have to build to be able to do that work. It's not something you can just do anywhere because it is illegal to view that kind of content in addition to being seriously damaging, right? And so a lot of what we've done is design ways to do certain types of very delicate trust and safety research in ways that are, that enable the team to put out amazing work while, not bumping into some of the sort of terrible sides of it. I also felt like because we have that breadth, because all of us work on all of these different project areas, right? Like I work on trust and safety, I work on our generative AI stuff, I work on our election integrity or information integrity work. We built an entire center on the idea of all of these challenges are interrelated because they happen on the same system. Like there's structural things here. How can we have that pipeline from quantitative empirical research to policy recommendations that also take into account the way that all of these things are related? There are very, very few institutions that have that type of analytical capacity and that have that vision of the internet as complex system. And so while there are many, many excellent institutions that do deep work on, topic A or topic B or that write exceptional policy briefs, what we really wanted to build at SIO, what we did build at SIO over 5 years, was this ability to study a very complex system at a holistic level and, make material impacts across a fairly broad array of topics. So I want that to exist, and I want to be doing it too.
Also, I would say, even if you're somebody who says, "Wow, there's this censorship industrial complex, and these academics have gotten out of control." I just want to remind us that what we're talking about is, should universities be able to study the way that narratives spread online? Should they have a sense of which narratives are gaining popularity? Which accounts are responsible for spreading them, right? How do these networks of ideas work? This is a sort of objective study of reality, and it is somehow being painted as this malicious effort to censor speech, right? So I just want to say that, you can have different opinions about what should we do about tweets we don't like, and should we be able to study the way that information spreads online?
I think what I actually found most disturbing, and the thing that I think I'm going to wind up writing about, is that there's a couple of tweets that go out from House Judiciary GOP and Jim Jordan saying explicitly victory. Right? And that's a thing that I don't know what it takes to jolt academia out of its complacency, to make them realize that this was the objective, right? That the objective was to silence the work of a First Amendment protected research project and team. And my frustration there is that when you have a sitting government official with subpoena power gloating about killing First Amendment protected work and then saying freedom of speech wins. I mean, that is, I feel like Orwellian is the most overused word on Twitter, but man, does that really...
Yeah. I want to ask about another part of the criticism of some of the work that you do that I actually think is sort of interesting. And it's not about Stanford or academia in particular, but it's about actually the role that government plays in this whole universe of online platform manipulation and disinformation. There's this word jawboning that gets used a lot in these debates. And for people who aren't familiar, it's basically job owning is sort of when the government is kind of applying pressure to private companies to kind of do something they want.
Even if they're not legally required to.
Right. So, it could be as simple as someone, from the White House, sending an email to the trust and safety team at Facebook or at another social network and saying, hey, we've got these 50 accounts that we believe are spreading misinformation. Maybe you should take a look at them. And maybe you want to sort of apply, a label to them or maybe even take them down. And we know, in part, thanks to some of these subpoenaed emails, that this kind of thing actually did happen. There were people in the Biden White House emailing platforms, talking with them about trying to get certain content taken down, and that sometimes the platforms pushed back and refused to do that, but sometimes they went along with it. So do you think this issue of job owning is real, and do you think the government has overstepped when it comes to trying to enforce social media policy on these platforms?
I think it's a really interesting question, right? Job owning is bad, right? We should be able to hold that idea in our head and say it is bad. It is not a thing that we should want as a democracy. We should want our government to do. There's a couple of nuances there, meaning that the government also has speech rights. The government also has particular incentives, for example, during a pandemic to communicate with platforms about here we are trying to prevail upon you for why you should do this thing. I think that that's best done perhaps a little bit more publicly. I think, though, interestingly, when it is, when you do see Biden say something in a public press conference, what did he say? You're killing people. Was that the sentence?
Yeah.
That's also sort of viewed as whoa,
This was something that he said about Facebook. During the COVID pandemic, basically accusing them of killing people by not removing more misinformation about vaccines and things like that.
Right. So there's a whole spectrum of government communications, public and private. At the same time, one of the things that we see is governments, not the United States, but other governments making explicit content takedown requests explicitly to throttle their political oppositions, right? You see the Modi government requesting Sikh politicians in Canada have their content throttled so that it can't be seen in India, right? That is, I would argue, rather transparently censorship in the actual sense of the word, right? So this is a worthwhile thing to be looking at. I think that Google in particular will put up these transparency reports where it says the government requested action on, and then it will sort of list content that governments request action on. I think that's a very reasonable thing for tech platforms to do, which is to say when these requests or asks come in, we're going to make them public, right? And that provides then, I think, kind of a check on government, because if they don't want that request being made public, then maybe they won't make it, right? Or if they feel like it's a very, very important thing and a thing that they want to request, they can either do it publicly themselves or make it public after the fact. I think we need government and platforms to have open channels of communication, particularly because there are certain areas where you do see Meta in some of its adversarial threat reporting about state actors in particular, like China, saying the government no longer talks to us because it's afraid of being seen as, somehow any communication is job owning. And that, I think, is also a very, very bad state for us to be in.
Your book, which I've been reading, is sort of about how we ended up in the place that we are now, which is where, you have millions of Americans who are deeply invested in conspiracy theories. It kind of feels like we have what you call bespoke reality, where everyone is just kind of stitching together their own sort of version of events based on the sources that they're following, the influencers they pay attention to and trust. We don't have a sort of broad consensus reality anymore. You also have some ideas in your book about how we could sort of start to make our way back to something like consensus reality, how we could start to sort of turn the tide of disinformation and extremism and all this stuff. Can you walk us through some of your ideas for that?
Yeah, so a big area of focus for me has been design, and that's because I think people hope for regulation. I'm a little bit more of a skeptic on the regulatory front, and that's mostly because from a purely pragmatic standpoint, I just don't see how anything gets passed in the United States, right? So the basic, we've been talking about tech reform and tech accountability and so on and so forth, and everything from antitrust to child safety to privacy to, and then you got a whole slew of very, very bad bills also. But nothing gets passed anyway. So it's okay, well, all right. I think what we look at here is the question of what did we used to do to arrive at consensus. We've always had heated debates. How did we get to a point where we could not have any kind of ability to bridge? I think one of the things that happens is when you have heated debates in your local neighborhood, you usually talk to your neighbors, right? You're geographically constrained. You see these people at the bus stop. You see them at the library. You don't spend all of your time screaming obscenities at them, you know.
No, you go on to Nextdoor like a reasonable person, and you write an all caps post complaining that your neighbor set off fireworks at 11 p.m. and it woke up the dogs. And no, that might just be my neighborhood.
I am no longer on Nextdoor. Yes, but no, I think there's you can have civil disagreements in the real world. I think it's hard to look somebody in the face and like accuse them of being a secret government whatever agent to silence them. You'd sound a little bit crazy if you did that. So the question is, how do you create that kind of environment where you can have heated debates, but in a better way? And so right now there's some work being done on what are called like bridging algorithms, right? And so I think it's important to note that everything that you see on a social media platform is ranked or curated in some way. This is why I've always been slightly mystified by the conversation about, my post is being censored because it's not, it's not being served to as many people as I would like. And I'm like, well, welcome to the internet, right? Everything is curated. Some algorithm somewhere is making a determination about that. And there's a sense that these algorithms are like somehow sacrosanct, right? Like we have to like freeze them at this moment in time because any change to them is somehow censorship or bad. In reality, you can surface content, you can prioritize in a feed ranking content that is just not caustic, right? You can have somebody who's expressing an opinion on abortion or Gaza or whatever else that is expressing it in a way that is like, articulates the point, gets the thing out there, but is not focused on, here is why my enemy is evil, right? So, because a lot of the time, here is why my enemy is evil is not inviting debate, discussion, or consensus. It's inviting a mob to go target your enemy. And I do think that we can just curate that a little bit differently. I think this is a very reasonable thing to try. So I think there's just interesting areas to interrogate with regard to design. And then the last piece is education, which is really, the book is not a book about social media. It says this is the infrastructure on which this happens. This is like the water in which we swim. But ultimately, it is people making the decision to click the share button, click the like button. And can we teach people to recognize certain types of rhetoric as, hey, this should actually be a red flag when you see something framed in this way where somebody's talking about like, they hate you, they don't want X, Y, Z. Can you make it so that kind of rhetoric is actually like, like low quality. Like this is not a thing you should be proud to boost. Like how can we teach people to recognize this is actually propaganda, right? This is pretty propaganda 101 over here. This is, can we get, rather than media literacy about sources and facts, can we just get to here is how these types of claims work on us psychologically and why maybe in that moment when you're that outraged, you actually shouldn't share. You should go look for more information.
So we need media literacy about rhetoric as well as the facts and the sources.
This was something that was done in the late 1920s, early 1930s, and I spend some time on it in the book, right? There was this radio priest, Father Coughlin. He was one of the first big, you can call him an influencer, right? He had 30 million listeners. The population of the U.S. was about 120 million people. Massively popular man who has this arc going from being, a populist in the sort of original definition of that term, right? A priest. He's a priest advocating for the people, but working with like FDR and others. He gradually becomes extremely disillusioned with that and descends into fascism. In, again, a literal sense, right? He is writing letters to Mussolini. He is praising Hitler. And that is where the man's arc goes with his 30 million listeners following along. And what's interesting is there's this group of academics, plucky academics, who start this thing called the Institute for Propaganda Analysis. And they begin to just annotate his speeches. They're not fact-checking them. They're not saying this is right, this is wrong. They're saying when he uses this rhetoric, like this, they call it like the glittering generality, this, these are the red flags. So they literally release annotated copies of his speeches. And I was absolutely blown away the first time I saw this with like emoji. They like the glittering generality has like a little diamond emoji, and they literally just like put the emoji in there. And I saw it and I was like, is this really from the 1930s? Like, my God, I use emojis in my talks for that reason, because I think, okay, it'll make people immediately click and remember that thing, like that sort of visual association. And like, there they are doing it in the 1930s. And I was like, okay, like, where did this all go?
One more question. I think a lot of people right now have the sense that disinformation is winning, right? That there's this kind of battle between the forces of truth and the forces of lies, and that we are just surrounded and inundated with lies and conspiracy theories and half-truths and misleading suggestions just everywhere you look. What do you think? Is disinformation winning?
I think that institutions do not know how to operate in this moment. That has been a source of frustration for me personally over the last year, and I'm not going to sugarcoat that away. I felt this acutely during COVID. I spent so much time during COVID writing these articles in The Atlantic. Like, wouldn't it be great if, public health, rather than being reticent, was like out there at the forefront saying, here's what we know right now. Will it change tomorrow? Maybe, but here's what we know right now, so that they're at least in the conversation. We even saw this back in 2015 when I was looking at the sort of vaccine conversations around measles. Public health was not even in the conversation. They were kind of off to the side, talking amongst themselves. When in the conspiracy theories about us, it was, just say nothing, right? It's just some people on the internet who are making stuff up. And I'm like, it has profound impact. You absolutely must get your side of the story out there into the world. Otherwise, there is nothing for anybody to work with. It is just stories about you, and you are not part of that conversation. So I think one of the reasons it feels like, disinformation is winning is that the institutions that the disinformation is often about just simply haven't adapted to the modern communication era, and they're just not putting anything out that would make it seem like there's a debate or a dispute, or the facts are the facts are out there, and instead they just say nothing. And that's something that I experienced over the last year, and it was very, very frustrating.
So if you want to win the information war, you can't just ignore the conspiracy theorists and the cranks anymore.
Well, you have to be in the game. That's the thing, where it's the idea that they don't understand that the game has changed, and that while they might not want to play it, they are in it. Do you remember the university presidents debacles, right? I mean, this was just this yet another. What do you think you are going into that hearing for? Do you think you're going into the hearing for oversight? You're not. You're going into it for a Twitter moment. What is the Twitter moment going to be here? And you just watch these things with incredible frustration, because they're not thinking in those terms. They're thinking we're going to be bland and boring, and we're going to get out of this, and no media is going to write an article because it was a very boring hearing. It's not how the world works today. And again, I think they need to be sort of jolted out of complacency. And I wrote the book in large part because I do think that we need to just change our thinking on that.
Renee, thanks so much for joining us. Really enjoyed your book. And the book is called Invisible Rulers, and it's out now.
Thank you so much.
Hey, that's the end of this clip. If you liked what you saw, head on over to our page and subscribe, and you can get the full podcast. We do a show like this almost every week on tech and the future. Head on over there now and subscribe.